Next agenda is panel session 1, Implications and Challenges of RCEP. May I invite Your Excellency Samheng Bora, Under Secretary of State of the Ministry of Commerce, to be the moderator of this first panel. Please, Excellency, the floor is yours.
A very warm morning to everyone. I do apologize slightly for the program. We are slightly delayed, about 30 minutes. So I guess I won't be taking too much of your time. The program this morning, we actually are joined by an incredibly wonderful list of speakers. Some of these speakers are actually my personal idol. So please stay tuned, and I hope that you will be able to gain quite a bit from the insightful studies that our speakers have been able to contribute to the monograph itself. For this first session, we are joined by speakers who have spent their tireless efforts in drafting the first few chapters of the RCEP monograph. We are divided into 3 different parts for this first session. So without further ado, let me begin by introducing our first part, which will be, I do hope to mention as well that after all 3 parts of the session have already presented their studies, we will go into a Q&A sessions. So please have your questions ready, and I will present it to our speakers. Please also specify which speakers you would like to ask the questions, and I will inform correctly. Our first speaker for this session is a world-leading researcher and authority on trade and East Asia integration, international production networks, and global value chain. He has published extensively with over 100 journal and book publications. He served as the Dean of the Graduate School of Economics at Keio University from 2015 to 2017, and was awarded the 10th Kojima Kiyoshi Prize Award by the Japan Society of International Economics in November 2015. Excellencies, ambassadors, distinguished guests, and colleagues, please join me in welcoming Professor Fukunari Kimura, Chief Economist of ERIA and Professor of Keio University. Professor Kimura will be speaking on the RCEP and regional integration potential growth. Thank you. Please welcome Professor. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair, for a really generous introduction. Excellencies, Cambodian colleagues, researchers, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for participating in this very important event. RCEP is a very, very important contribution to the region. And particularly, this is important for Cambodia as a chair of ASEAN this year, because RCEP is not the final product, final fixed product yet. This should be a living and evolving agreement. So we have to utilize this vehicle for push forward to our deeper economic integration in ASEAN and East Asia. So Cambodia's role is very, very important. We really have to set on the right track for ASEAN, for RCEP to be living and evolving agreement. So next, please. So in my short talk, I'd like to talk about the implication of RCEP for international division of labor in this region, because primarily trade agreement will affect the international trade, and as a background, the production location, and then the international division of labor. So actually, we call it Factory Asia. This is basically ASEAN and surrounding East Asia. Actually, RCEP is really covering the whole Factory Asia. So this is a very important thing that we have to think of, the implication of RCEP. We have 2 kinds of international division of labor, in a sense, in Factory Asia. One is already going, since the 1990s, we have so-called international production networks, IPNs, particularly in machinery industries, but partially garment industry with a just-in-time system would be a part of it. ASEAN and East Asia are leading this type of international division of labor for the world. Actually, this aspect is very, very important. Now, Factory Asia is really dominating the world, particularly in general machinery and electric machinery, vis-a-vis Factory Europe or Factory North America. The second type of international division of labor is now emerging, still quantitatively small, but we are having a digital technology, and that encourages the development of digitalized and digitalizing services. So we would have a different type of international division of labor soon. So the RCEP is actually contributing to both types of international division of labor. Things are, some are really traditional way of doing, some are a sort of novel way of doing, further liberalization of trade in goods, services, and investment. These are continuously very, very important. And also more than that, the rule-based trading regime really stabilizes the region. Businessmen can do their own business with comfort. Some predictable trading regime is very, very important for this type, our types of sophisticated international division of labor. So RCEP will contribute to the international division of labor in this region. Next, please. This is one so really sketchy illustration of what sort of international division of labor is going on in the world. Starting from so-called the first unbundling, this is an industry by industry division of labor. So even if a trading regime is not very good, still we can do this type of international division of labor. Say a really slow type of garment industry, resource-based industry, those are not really in just in time. So I think certainly tariffs and other trading barriers will be an obstacle, but it was not very, very crucial. Still, we have big differences in wage level and others across countries. So we could have the first unbundling. This is basically the unbundling between production side and consumption side. But East Asia, including ASEAN, were shifting to the so-called second unbundling, particularly in machinery industries and some part of other industries, including garment. So this is a task by task, production process by production process, division of labor. So now the whole production is fragmented, and then some production blocks are in country A, another is in country B, another is country C. So we have a complicated international production networks. Now, so the trade is done for parts and components rather than just raw materials and final products. Parts and components should be delivered in a timely manner, and a really reliable link is very, very important. So that's why the trading regime must be really stable, predictable, and also not only tariff removal, but various kinds of trade facilitation and facilitating services. Those are going to be very important. And also foreign direct investment is a really crucial factor for the second unbundling. ASEAN and East Asia are very successful in utilizing the second unbundling, but still in the CLM particularly, still a lot of room for coming into the second unbundling deeply. Now we are really observing changes in many ASEAN countries. Vietnam, changed very drastically in the past 10 years. The next is Cambodia, definitely. So still we have a lot of room for utilizing second unbundling. The third unbundling that is emerging, still quantitatively not very, very big, but this is an individual level international division of labor. So in order to do one task, individuals located in different countries are working together. So this is in the form of a service outsourcing. This is really coming in the case of, say, India and also the Philippines, they are doing so-called business process processing operations a lot. This is one form of service outsourcing, or English conversation class delivered from Cebu Island in the Philippines that is consumed in Tokyo, for example. These are the third unbundling. So these are emerging. We have to have some policy environment for this type of international division of labor too. Then digital technology is coming in. Actually, digital technology is affecting all sorts of international division of labor, particularly in the kind of second unbundling. We would have much more sophisticated production networks. The third unbundling, we have to explore the frontiers of new businesses with digital technology. Next, please. People are worrying about the robustness and the resilience of production networks. Actually, certainly we observe a big shock coming from COVID-19. But actually, international production networks, particularly the core part, machinery industries, that production networks were very robust and resilient. So that is different from people's perception probably, but the core part was actually working as a built-in stabilizer. So you can see the graph. This is the changes in machinery exports by the world, by East Asia, by North America, by Europe. So this is divided into general and electric machinery, transport equipment, and also precision machinery. You can see a big trough in April or May in 2020. But certainly the first shock was big, coming from COVID-19, particularly in transport equipment. You can see in the world, North America, Europe, we see a big trough, big drop in the first wave. But you can see in East Asia, actually drop was much, much smaller. And particularly in the case of general machinery, electric machinery, trough was not really evident. So almost not much change. This is vis-a-vis each month of 2019. So actually, the shock itself was not really huge for these industries, and particularly general and electric machinery had so-called positive demand shocks. Because of COVID-19, the demand for general machinery and electric machinery increased actually rather than decreased. So many are shifting to work at home and doing do it yourself type stuff, stay home, and then personal computers, displays, dishwashers, or so electric hand drills. So those are really having an increasing demand. So that would help a lot for East Asia. So people say that global value chains were really fragile, and we have to do that. It's partially true, but partially quite wrong. So particularly in the case of international production networks in East Asia, actually that was really robust and resilient. So we can rely on this type of international division of labor continuously. Next, please. This is a bit complicated, but actually this is a so-called trade matrix. Rows are exporters, columns are importers, and we have actual trade values in 2019. This is machinery trade only. You can see predicted values. This is coming from a gravity equation exercise. So after controlling the country size, exporter side and importer side, and also physical distance and others, what would be a sort of a world average predicted values? And we then compare that with the actual trade values. You can see ASEAN and ASEAN sell. This is ASEAN's exports to ASEAN. 271% of the predicted value. So ASEAN is exporting ASEAN in machineries, actually 271% than compared with the predicted value. So actually ASEAN is compared after controlling countryside, actually exporting a lot. You can see North America only 104, Europe 117. So the commitment to production networks is very, very keen in ASEAN and ASEAN. And also ASEAN is having a lot of transactions with China, Japan, Korea particularly, and also exporting a lot to other parts of the world. So it's quite natural that the ASEAN is at the center of economic integration in this region because that is really supporting Factory Asia. I would like to have some individual countries data too. So this time I did not show you, but Cambodia is really changing very rapidly in the past 10 years. But still a lot of room for doing that. So we can see a lot of further potential for utilizing this type of international division of labor. Next, please. For digital technology, we are having a big boom of digital technology in the past 20 years. First, we have a relatively simplistic matching businesses. So disruptive innovation generates a lot of new business opportunities. So people are doing that. A lot of trials, a lot of failures, and we have some unicorns sometimes. Not really doing step-by-step R&D like incremental innovation. But after 2015 or so, the major businesses of digital-related businesses is shifting from simplistic matching businesses to upgrading innovation, upgrading innovation in other industries, including some manufacturing and other services. So actually, we are in the boom of digital transformation in all sectors, actually. Next, please. If we look at the R&D stock and also IT stock, and you can see this is a vis-a-vis GDP in 2019. Some countries like Japan, Korea, US, Singapore, doing a lot of R&D, but at the same time doing IT hardware, software investment. We can see that in other countries too. So in the past, we just recommend really big R&D for all countries. Perhaps a new growth model may be different. We need more IT investment rather than doing a lot for the traditional R&D. Next, please. So with COVID-19, remote works are coming in, and that accelerates servicification and also lower the psychological barrier against cross-border services outsourcing. So that is sort of the third unbundling. So you can see this kind of boom is coming in soon. Next, please. Still, this sort of service trade is quantitatively small. In the upper part, this is an estimation by mode of the transaction, mode 1, mode 2, mode 3, mode 4. Actually, mode 3 estimates are very difficult. So this is a sort of temporary one. But it's, still mode 3 is very important. So the liberalization for investment is still very, very important, probably. But so we have a lot of room for expansion of this kind of activities. Next, please. So I think RCEP would contribute to international division of labor a lot in this region, but we should not forget that R&D should be as a living and evolving agreement. One thing is that we have homework in the text of RCEP. All commitments are not done yet. For example, some countries should shift services liberalization scheme from positive list approach to negative list approach. So we have to do homework for that. And also we have to upgrade RCEP in terms of liberalization and rulemaking. And also communication channel is very, very important to reduce policy risks. RCEP should be utilized in that kind of occasion. And also strengthening ASEAN centrality. This is also a very important role. Next, please. The last page shows the differences. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was a very, very comprehensive presentation, and we do appreciate you for that. Please bear with us. The quick Q&A session will come on after. So that was, I think for me in general, I'm very looking forward to see the potential growth that ASEAN could gain, especially for Cambodia as well. Without further ado, I do hope to present 3 more distinguished speakers for the second part of this session. So the first would be, please allow me to present Dr. Aladdin D. Rido, who is currently a Senior Economic Advisor for the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. Prior to that, he worked at the ASEAN Secretariat for many years, where he served in various positions, the latest as the Deputy Secretary General for the ASEAN Economic Community. Joining Dr. Rido is Her Excellency Ana Maria Rosario D. Robeniol, who is currently the advisor to the Deputy ASEAN Secretary General. She held many important senior positions at the ASEAN Secretariat and the Philippines government. Her Excellency Ana is also a leading authority on ASEAN economic integration. And finally, we have Mr. Salvador M. Buban, who is serving as the Policy Fellow at ERIA. Mr. Buban is a trade policy expert with more than 20 years of experience in trade policy formulation and trade integration negotiations, particularly with respect to multilateral and regional trades in the areas of market access for trade in goods, SPS, TBT, rule of origin, custom procedures, and trade facilitation, FTA implementation, capacity building, and regional integration. Prior to joining ERIA, Mr. Buban has served as Trade Facilitation Advisor of the USAID, Trade-Related Assistance for Development, and held senior positions at ASEAN Secretariat. All 3 distinguished speakers will be speaking on the history, negotiations, and structures of RCEP together. Excellencies, ambassadors, distinguished guests, and colleagues, please welcome our speakers.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me well. Good morning again, and it is indeed my pleasure to be part of this important event. My name is Al Rilo from ERIA, and I will be doing the presentation on behalf of my other colleagues, Ms. Ana Robeniol from ASEC and Salvador Buban from ERIA. They are actually my co-authors for this particular paper. So my presentation will basically try to explore 3 important questions related to the history, structure and negotiation, and the future directions of RCEP. I think the first question here that is important to be able to understand RCEP is the question of what signifies RCEP. As we all know, RCEP has gone into a long process of negotiations for 8 years. But I think we need to understand that even before that, in the early years, there were a number of triggers and turning points and events that actually influence ASEAN to consider seriously the need to engage with external partners as a part of the development strategy. These developments would include, among others, for example, the need to build regional economic resilience following the Asian financial crisis in 1997, the imperative to deal with global and regional threats, including, for example, the rise of China and the failure of the WTO. And finally, the emergence of different and various geopolitical tensions, such as the 2008 global financial crisis and later on the US-China trade wars. I think to be sure, these events, structural changes, have underpinned or necessitated the need for ASEAN to consider a deeper intra-regional cooperation. And somehow these events also compelled both ASEAN and East Asia to consider establishing a regional FTA such as RCEP, such that, as we all know, by November of 2011, ASEAN leaders have endorsed the framework for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that has to become known later as RCEP. But I think the most important factor here, the way I see it, as far as the initial success of RCEP, is the role that ASEAN centrality has played in the evolution of RCEP. This was also something that Professor Kimura and Professor Nishimura have mentioned early on during the remarks. But what is exactly the ASEAN centrality that we're talking here? I think ASEAN centrality can be interpreted in two ways. One is in terms of the ability of ASEAN countries to facilitate discussions on the basis of its multi-layered engagement in East Asia. For example, we have the ASEAN +1, ASEAN +3, and ASEAN +6 process. At the same time, we can look at ASEAN centrality in terms of the ability of ASEAN to be able to initiate substance as well as to set directions. And I think one very good example of this, as far as RCEP is concerned, is when ASEAN took the lead in drafting the guiding principles and objectives of negotiating RCEP, which is an important set of documents as they actually serve the basis for the launch of the negotiations of RCEP in 2012, and also serve as an important reference for the conduct of the actual negotiations of RCEP that began in 2013. I think looking at all these developments, I think what is important to recognize here is that ASEAN's centrality, or the desire by ASEAN to promote centrality, is, in my sense, one important factor that actually contributed to the initial success of RCEP. And in fact, that kind of centrality also helped in ending all the preliminary debates on whether to establish an EAFTA or CPEA with regards to the East Asian FTA. The second question here that I think is very relevant in understanding RCEP is to be able to recognize RCEP for what it is and also for what it is not. I think we all recognize that RCEP, or the agreement itself, is not a simple agreement. By, for example, bringing together 15 very diverse economies with different levels of economic development and different levels of ambitions, and getting them agree on the set of rules is not an easy feat. And I think it is also important to recognize here that during the course of negotiating RCEP, there are a lot of challenges that hampered the dynamics and the progress of negotiations, which in a way also demonstrated the complexity of negotiating a mega FTA such as RCEP. One important challenge here, the way we see it, is the lack of readiness by some RCEP participating countries, or RPCs, to be able to exercise flexibility. Many, if not all RPCs, have actually maintained very hardline positions on many issues. And I think that really complicated the ability to agree on a number of issues, even though those issues required prolonged discussions at different levels, at the working group level, at the TNC level, and even at the ministerial level. Some RPCs also were not able in my view, to recalibrate their positions and ambitions on a number of most pressing issues. For example, how to agree on the common concession for the market for trade in goods, how to achieve commercially meaningful outcomes for services trade integration and investment, and whether or not to go beyond the current commitments and obligations made at the WTO. Finally, there was also this challenge of the tendency of some RPCs to introduce new elements. And I think that made the issues more problematic and also led to a lot of tricky issues, and in a way also hampered the progress of negotiations. And this is particularly true towards the latter part of the negotiations, wherein some countries had the tendency to introduce new elements, even though decisions have already been made on some of these areas for negotiations. As I mentioned earlier, this actually did not only hamper the progress of the negotiations, but in a way also dampen the momentum for ensuring that the negotiations would finally come into close. But the way I see it, despite all these different challenges of managing a mega FTA such as RCEP, I think it is important to recognize here that we have to look at the final outcome, right, of the negotiations, particularly in terms of how RCEP was able to provide additional value add, right, into the trading architecture in our region. For example, despite the fact that RCEP does not provide pioneering breakthroughs in trade governance, in a sense that if you look at RCEP, most of the commitments have actually been streamlined from the existing bilateral trading arrangements. I think RCEP is still a very significant agreement in a sense that RCEP was able to improve the quality of FTA in ASEAN. If you notice, beyond the simple objective of consolidating the ASEAN +1 FTAs, ASEAN or RCEP was able to actually improve the quality of the RCEP agreement by, for example, introducing additional disciplines into the agreement, such as IPR, competition, e-commerce, as well as the government procurement. Although we must admit that these chapters are actually relatively modest, but in my personal view, they are good enough to be able to address some of those issues for now. At the same time, if you look at RCEP, I think this is the first, this is the agreement that tries to unify or create a new set of rules that would try to establish a more unified trading environment in the region. And RCEP also is the first ASEAN-led multilateral trading agreement that actually embraces multilateralism when other regions in the world have become very skeptical actually on the benefits of globalization. So RCEP is, in my view, is a living proof of how countries still embrace multilateralism in this current world. If you look at RCEP, again, the most important achievement here is that RCEP was finally being finalized, the negotiations for after 8 years of intense negotiations. I think this is an important achievement for the region, but at the same time, we have to recognize that in winning the negotiations, there are two important factors that actually contributed to that. One is the ability of RCEP to manage the trust deficit. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if you look at RCEP, it's a very challenging agreement to negotiate in the sense that there is an absence of bilateral FTAs among some RPCs. Also, there's different levels of ambition, right? Different levels of economic development among RPCs. And also, there was also the difficulty, in my view, of actually selling RCEP to domestic stakeholders, particularly to the market players. I think that became a very important challenge, not to mention the fact that within the region, within ASEAN, the ability to build ASEAN consensus in a way also contributed to some delays in resolving some important issues, and also the tendency of some members of RCEP to compare RCEP with the CPTPP or that particular agreement. But after that, I think we all agree that despite that the starting from that level of limited trust among participating countries, RCEP was able to build the trust, to be able to build that confidence of the importance of economic partnership. And that, in my view, is a very, very important contribution of RCEP as far as its initial success. The second important factor here is the ability of RCEP to manage technical issues. As you can see in this slide, there are a number of tricky and very difficult issues that need to be negotiated during the last the long 8 years, including, for example, tariff liberalization or tariff differentials, even challenges related to how to streamline the rules of origin across the ASEAN +1 FTAs, involving very technical issues related to the country of origin, formulation, declaration of origin, specific product rules. And at the same time, if you look at other areas within the agreement, there is also the difficulty of the scheduling of commitments in the services chapter of RCEP, and also a lot of issues related to MFN, ratchet, and other investment-related issues. And of course, we must not forget about issues related to India, right? Which became more entrenched and more prominent, particularly after India decided to opt out, okay, from the agreement. But again, despite all these technical difficulties, what is important to highlight here is the final outcome, right? At the end of the day, after going through all these very technical issues, RCEP was able to manage to overcome and solving these technical issues. And here I would like to highlight again the importance of ASEAN centrality. ASEAN centrality actually has become an important factor that led to the successful management and completion of the negotiations. From day one up to the last day of negotiations, ASEAN was able to commit and ensure that all these different differences in opinions and differences in addressing the technical issues will be effectively being addressed. So that in a way also would imply how ASEAN has become very committed from day one in terms of ensuring that RCEP will become a reality. This brings me to the last issue that I would like to discuss. And I think this is the question of what is the future of RCEP, right? If you look at RCEP, RCEP is not a perfect trade agreement. I think everybody recognizes that. There are limitations on what RCEP can do. But despite all those limitations, we also have to recognize that RCEP, for now, is the largest trade agreement in the world. Therefore, given that, it has the potential and the capacity to change the current global and regional trading architecture. But to be able to achieve that the way I see it, it is very important that we have to implement RCEP well, right? And that is why the issue of ratifying RCEP becomes very crucial at this point in time. I'm hoping that all ASEAN countries will be able to ratify it this year or even as soon as possible. And at the same time, RPCs, or the RCEP participating countries, should be able to set the right priorities to ensure that there is an effective implementation of this RCEP agreement. So what are those priorities? I think one important priority here, the way I see it, is the need to address the unfinished business of RCEP, or those technical issues that would require more time for RCEP participating countries to make commitments on. This would include, for example, addressing the built-in agenda. One very good example of that is the revision of the schedules of tariff commitments, that need to be implemented as soon as possible, the way I see it. As I mentioned earlier, there's also a need to ensure that commitments are implemented well after the entry into force of RCEP. And at the same time, there is also an imperative to ensure that the countries are able to utilize the review provisions, right, under RCEP, in order to ensure that RCEP becomes more relevant with the changing global and regional economic landscape. Otherwise, without that ability to adapt RCEP to the changing global and regional economic landscape, RCEP would actually lose its relevance. The second important priority here is to make sure that RCEP, as well as the ASEAN Economic Community, would reinforce each other. At the end of the day, if you look at RCEP and AEC, they are actually working on the same goal in terms of enhancing the competitiveness of the region. When I look at both RCEP and AEC, I think there are two areas of complementarities that need to be strengthened here. One is the ability, for example, to leverage on the economic impact of RCEP as far as the regional income and employment is concerned. One estimate suggests that RCEP by 2030 will add to around $245 billion per year. And at the same time, it will add to 2.8 million jobs in terms of regional employment. So the possibilities are tremendous here. Therefore, in my view, those positive spillovers will definitely impact also on the ability of ASEAN to be able to further deepen our own market integration. At the same time, if you look at RCEP, there is the ability to set new trade rules that I think would be very, very important in terms of enhancing the competitiveness of the region. As I mentioned earlier, there are a built-in agenda that needs to be expanded in the future under RCEP, including, for example, issues related to the accumulation of ROO, the introduction of ISDS in investor protection, and even the review of the RCEP and MFN in the investment chapter. I think all of this, in my view, will create more positive impact in terms of how ASEAN is able to further deepen the integration in the region to ensure that the competitiveness of the region is being secured at the same time that the contestability of our markets is also becoming more entrenched. Finally, I think we all also recognize here that we need to look at RCEP, or need to be able to leverage on RCEP to be able to make ASEAN and East Asia the most dynamic hub for regionalism, and also an important platform to be able to promote multilateral economic cooperation. If you look at RCEP now, there's a lot of possibilities, there's a lot of potentials there, because RCEP, as we all know, is able to set a new rules for trade, as well as new better facilitation measures that I think would help in the restructuring of the global trade patterns and the supply chains, and definitely would help in the post-pandemic recovery. Similarly, RCEP has a very positive and very generous provisions as far as the technical and economic cooperation is concerned. And for me, that is very crucial in a sense that it would provide more impetus in terms of providing more cooperation between the developed and developing economies, and of course to lend more support to multilateral cooperation. And finally, again, we have to look at RCEP in terms of its ability to address a number of global challenges, not only in the region, but in the rest of the world. The current pandemic is definitely a case in point, wherein, for example, the ability of RCEP to provide new trade rules and provide more trade facilitation measures, in my view, would help in the restructuring of the global value chains that would help in the post-pandemic recovery. Similarly, RCEP has important provisions on digitalization that would help also ASEAN and in terms of how we can further promote digitalization to support the post-pandemic recovery. And moving forward, I think as RCEP continues to expand and address a number of issues such as environment and labor, I think that would also create more momentum for ASEAN in terms of being able for ASEAN to incorporate all these new elements into the sustainability agenda of ASEAN, which I think will become more crucial, particularly after 2025. This is the end of my presentation, and thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions later on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Rilo. That was much appreciated. I think you are completely correct in addressing the crucial relevance of RCEP for the post-pandemic recovery. Thank you for that. We do hope to come back to you at a later point for the Q&A. So without further ado, I do hope to introduce our next speakers. The third part of the session will be on the implications of RCEP for Asian regional integration. And it is joined by Professor Peter Drysdale, who is the Emeritus Professor of Economics and the head of the East Asian Bureau of Economic Research and East Asia Forum at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. He is widely recognized as the leading intellectual architect of APEC. He is the author of a number of books and papers on international trade and economic policy in East Asia and the Pacific, including his prize-winning book, The International Economic Pluralism, Economic Policy in East Asia and the Pacific. He is a recipient of the Asia Pacific Prize, the Weary Dunlop Award, the Japanese Order of the Rising Sun with gold rays and neck ribbon, and the Australian Centenary Medal, and is a member of the Order of Australia. Joining us also is Dr. Shido Armstrong, an economist and associate professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy. He is the director of the Australia-Japan Research Center, editor of the East Asia Forum, director of the East Asian Bureau of Economic Research, and research associate at the Center on Japanese Economy and Business at the Columbia Business School. Excellencies, ambassadors, distinguished guests, and colleagues, please welcome our distinguished speakers.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I'll kick off first and go through some slides and then hand over to Professor Peter Drysdale. So I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Yes, look, it's a real pleasure to present our chapter, and I've shortened the title here to RCEP and Asian Regional Architecture, and I think it builds nicely off the previous two presentations. So what we really want to get to here is the potential of RCEP to shape outcomes in East Asia, and really we're going to talk a fair bit about the economic cooperation agenda, which is a pillar in the RCEP agreement. So let me start with the context, which I think we're all familiar with and we've talked about already this morning. But I think it's important to go through this context because, as Kimura-san and others have said, RCEP coming into force is only the beginning, it's not the end. It's very much a living and evolving agreement. And these issues, structural global issues and challenges, help define the priorities for cooperation within RCEP going forward. So, of course, RCEP being the world's largest regional economic agreement comes into force at a time of great uncertainty. Note these are all very familiar to you: COVID-19 pandemic, of course, and the global recession, US-China strategic competition, and the geopolitics playing out, not just between the United States and China, of course, but across Europe now with Russian invasion of Ukraine. Of course, protectionism on the rise, and the multilateral trading system with the WTO at its heart under threat. You can probably add the challenge and opportunities from new technologies to this list. The important thing is that these are all correlated risks, correlated challenges that are adding to uncertainty. So it is remarkable that in this context that we were able to conclude RCEP and bring it into force. So even with the rising protectionism and US-China strategic competition and all those other risks, to be able to get to completion and then signing, and most countries ratifying last year, and finally RCEP coming into force this year. I think it's worth reflecting on that, as other speakers have. RCEP, importantly, presents a new era for East Asian economic cooperation. So this is a departure from previous economic cooperation in East Asia that has been voluntary and non-binding. So we now have a region-wide legally binding agreement that brings new market openings, new trade liberalization, as well as new rules. It's importantly ASEAN-centered and not China-led, as quite often portrayed in the media and in North America, perhaps. And we all know that because, of course, it was ASEAN at its core, and ASEAN led the negotiations. ASEAN's the hub, and it consolidates and multilateralizes the ASEAN +1 free trade agreements. Importantly, I think it strengthens ASEAN centrality, as my previous speakers have mentioned, and it allows ASEAN to continue to play, we hope, this neutral broker role in the region, where we're surrounded by great powers and great power competition. The agreement brings China, Japan, and South Korea into an agreement for the first time. There's, of course, a bilateral agreement between China and South Korea, but this significantly improves the quality of that bilateral hub within this broader agreement. And despite the political difficulties and the ups and downs between Japan and China, Japan and South Korea, they are now in the same framework. And of course, RCEP has a secretariat and a ministerial process, including leaders' meetings around the ASEAN meetings. So that's important enough, but what now? And this is where I think I want to focus the rest of the presentation and talk about the economic cooperation agenda and the potential for that. That does a number of things, and I'll go through that in a second. But really, I think we can think about this as an opportunity to engage India in areas of common interest and expand Factory Asia, as Kimura-san was presenting. That can be informally done through processes like we've seen at APEC, but also it's a pathway for other new members, perhaps Bangladesh and others that have showed interest. But of course, it gives us the opportunity to negotiate new rules, but also build understanding and confidence in cooperation towards further market opening. It also provides a platform for multilateralizing some of the provisions in RCEP over time, just as ASEAN did over time. And of course, the important trans-Asian, so East to South Asian cooperation and trans-Pacific economic integration needs to be considered in this economic cooperation framework. More specifically, I think it's not that difficult to think about where this has come from and the potential, given that the Australia or ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Agreement has this economic cooperation provision in there. ASEAN has a lot of experience in this, and as well as APEC, of course, on economic and technical cooperation. So at the very least, it's going to play a very important role in capacity building and technical cooperation. But I think there's a real opportunity to go much further than that and think about experience sharing and using this framework for economic and political cooperation beyond just the implementation of RCEP commitments, which are important enough. It's really, if the framework is got right, it's a way for countries to build trust and understanding between them and build confidence. Not everything can or should be negotiated immediately. I think there's a lot to be said for building trust and agreeing to principles for cooperation. It can be a platform for concerted unilateral action, unilateral reform and liberalization, just as APEC and ASEAN have done in the past. And as I mentioned, the multilateralization of RCEP, this can be a framework for cooperation towards open regionalism, to make the agreement outward looking towards the Pacific, towards South Asia and beyond. There's a real opportunity because the agreement, the framework for economic cooperation is still in the process of being defined. So on the left here, I'll just present some what we argue as suggested issues for economic cooperation. And of course, the first one is COVID recovery and coordination. There are a whole host of issues that we need international cooperation on that should start in the region around travel and vaccine protocols. Of course, other areas where there is a lot of movement, a lot of discussion to be had around digital economy, energy transition, and infrastructure investment, agreeing to principles, agreeing to coordination. And I think those are ones that we suggest, but I think they're pretty obvious going forward. So just on the final slide here, going forward, of course, implementation is going to be very important for RCEP, but this grouping and the weight and the scale and the diversity and the interests suggest that this is an excellent framework for projecting Asia's multilateral interests globally. The economic cooperation agenda, as I mentioned, can deepen economic and political cooperation, but it's also possible to engage India and others around agendas of shared interests. So I think it's the experience sharing, the cooperation can over time deepen reform and tackle behind the border issues. And as I mentioned, multilateralized aspects of RCEP. So look, I'll hand it over to my co-author, Peter Drysdale there, and look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Shiro. Let me just add one main point to what Shiro has said. As Shiro has said, and others have said, the negotiation of RCEP at a time of international turbulence has been a huge achievement. But what's going to matter to how worthwhile it is what we do over the next 7 or 8 months as we move towards the ministerial meeting and the leaders meeting at the RCEP summit. The first ministers meeting and leaders summit will be a critical moment in realizing the ambitions of RCEP to build trust and confidence among members and to broaden the commitment to the multilateral system when it's in bad shape. So what does RCEP have to do to achieve that? Well, it has to do a few pretty simple things, but very strategic things. And in particular, to send clear signals to be delivered by the RCEP leaders at that ministerial level and leaders level. The first signal it has to send is RCEP's affirmation that we've been talking about this morning of RCEP's roots in the WTO and its clear adherence to WTO principles. The second thing it has to do is to declare RCEP members' intention to explore the value of moving to the MPIA, the interim dispute settlement mechanism at the heart of the WTO, when that's in abeyance. There are only 4 members of RCEP that presently are signatories to that agreement, and RCEP can declare its intention to explore the benefits of joining on with those 4 members to that agreement. The third thing that it can do is make a clear statement of resolve the best practice norms in trade behaviour, because they're under stress at the moment because of the spillovers of the conflict in Europe and also because of the use of trade coercion in the conduct of trade policy. So a declaration of adherence to the best practice trade behaviour is an important starting point for RCEP. And finally, as others have said this morning also, there should be specific initiatives on COVID recovery and economic cooperation. These 4 signals can direct the force and impact of RCEP beyond the region and globally. These steps seem fairly simple, but we'll need to do a great deal of work together in the coming months to achieve them. If we can get these messages from RCEP leaders, they would be hugely important to the stabilization and defense of the global trade regime, and hugely important impetus to regional integration and political stability. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Shiro, and especially as well to Professor Drysdale for your input. And it is quite unfortunate that we are not able to meet in person. All of our speakers today are truly honorable academics and are very well versed in their field of works. So thank you again. I do hope to move ourselves into the Q&A session. I do believe that we are slightly short on time, so instead of taking too many questions, I hope to focus on one at this moment. I see that there is a question in relation to the narrowing gap of economic development in ASEAN member states. And it is also tie in closely with a questions that we have ourselves as well, which is in relation to the challenges of RCEP, given the diverse stages of the development of RCEP member countries. And it seems that the diversity is the strength of multilateral agreements such as RCEP. So I think for this part, I do hope to address the questions to Professor Kimura. Perhaps you have some inputs on the widening gap or the gap itself within the member countries.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very, very important question. Actually, the International Division of Labor in ASEAN and East Asia are really based on the differences in the development stages across countries. So it's quite different from, say, for example, Western Europe type economic integration. So we have huge wage gaps across countries, and also urban and rural have really huge development gaps too. So by doing International Division of Labor, those gaps are narrowing. Actually, that's a very, very important implication. So I think having different development stages is not a barrier for economic integration, but it's probably a blessing. We really have to utilize differences in development stages for International Division of Labor to narrowing development gaps. That's a basic philosophy of ASEAN economic integration and also East Asian economic integration. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I think on that note as well, I do believe that because timing of a slight constraint this morning, we do hope to address a few more questions, of course, and if the speakers yourself is open, we do hope to send the questions towards your email, I think, as we move on into the next sessions of our program. Thank you so much for joining us, and I do hope that sometime soon we will be able to meet in person, and we will be able to learn a lot more. As they say, reading the text is not as good as hearing it from the actual people that did the study themselves. So highly appreciated for your participation, and we do hope to see you again very soon. Thank you. Thank you so much, professors.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.